So we can start, sir.
Good morning, friends. Welcome to the weekend session on Ind AS. Today we are having with us V. Ramanujan, the today's speaker. All the friends, pleasant good morning to each one of you. And today we are dealing with the Ind AS 27, 28. Today's speaker, CA V. Ramanujan sir, having a rich experience. I think even yesterday, our ICA announced the Ind AS certificate courses from October 3rd onwards. There are a couple of batches announced from 27 to 32 batches has been announced yesterday by ICA with respect to the Ind AS certification courses. Coming to the today's speaker profile, it's my privilege to introduce today's speaker, V. Ramanujan. He is a chartered accountant and company secretary with an industry experience of more than 15 years in the field of reporting, taxation, and corporate planning. He is also a diploma in IFR from ACCA and a DISA holder from ICA. With this brief profile of V. Ramanujan sir, I present V. Ramanujan sir to the August audience for this today's Ind AS program. Thank you, Ramanujan sir. Over to Ramanujan sir for taking session.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir, and welcome everyone, members, students, and senior members. Welcome everyone, and I know it's going to be really hard to get up on a Saturday morning. That's the most difficult thing which I felt. It's been a long time that we get up so early on a Saturday morning, and that too sitting before a session for next 2 hours. So thanks for making it, and we will ensure that your weekend you get the benefit of getting early. So I'm sharing my screen. Is that visible?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Sure. Thanks. Thanks. So this is how we thought we can arrange the session. First, we will share a few ideas on the consolidated financial statements, predominantly Ind AS 110. Maybe we will spend some 45 minutes there. Then we can have a thought sharing session of say 10-15 minutes, wherein request members to share their thoughts. Then we will move on to joint arrangements, then investments in associates or separate financial statements, and then we'll close it off with the interest in other entities, Ind AS 112. Again, let us have some of the thoughts once we have closed these things. I request members to put in their comments in the discussion column in the chat box. In case whenever they find they need some clarifications, please put up your queries in the chat box, and request other members as well, other participants as well, to be interactive in the chat box. I'll keep the chat box. Yeah. Okay. So I'll keep the chat box open. Maybe we'll check the chat box 10 minutes. So once there are clarifications from the participants, I request also participants to try to answer that, clarify that. We can take it up once we have, say, a sizable number of clarifications. We can take it up as we move along. Right. So we will start off with consolidated financial statements, Ind AS 110. Of course, giving a background on this Ind AS, we had a consolidation model earlier, which was there globally in IFRS. In Ind AS, we did have a consolidation standard, but it was felt at some point of time that it didn't give out the assumptions, the judgments that were required by those standards had certain wherein all the entities which were there part of the group were not being reported. So at the time of global crisis, where we had there was so much of hue and cry on the importance of being transparent, and especially those special purposes entities where the company didn't hold any shares, but still had that power to control those entities which were not reported under the earlier control model. So all those things, there was a necessity to bring it under this reporting umbrella. So there was a standard which was being made. The existing standard was revised, and IFRS 10 was being issued globally, which was also adopted in India as Ind AS 110. And the main purpose of this is to have an information on the entity, on the resources that is available to the entity, and what are the claims against those resources, and the net cash that is available, based on which the investors can take a decision to invest or otherwise into the organization. So to give that transparency, there was a control definition was changed, and the entire reporting framework was changed, and revised standard of IFRS 10, which came into effect, which was also being adopted in India as Ind AS 110. So the coverage in this standard, the coverage, just a minute. So from a coverage, we will understand the control, the most important aspect of this standard. The idea is to, there are the control, the judgment portion that is there in the standards, plus there is an accounting portion. What I call an accounting reporting is the consolidation process, how to consolidate all those things. So we'll split this standard into two. One is on the control portion, second is on the consolidation, how the once the control is established, how it has to be consolidated, and how it has to be reported. So first, let us the coverage would be on the control, and how should one entity test whether it is being controlled or it is controlling another entity, and what are the principles of control, which is the basis for consolidation, and how the accounting requirements are there around the consolidated financial statements, and how it has to be consolidated. Of course, one slide on the investment entity. So predominantly our first section would be on the control, to understand what is control, how it has to be tested, and what are the principles that are to be tested to ensure whether the entity is controlling other entity or not. Right? We will have logical breaks, say maybe after we have done with the control, maybe we can take up few discussion points, and then we can move on to the accounting requirements, how to consolidate all these things. So the requirement of the standard to start with is pretty simple. Again, one more thing before we start off with the standards, there are adequate materials, adequate in the sense what I mean, really voluminous material, but very light material on the application guidance and the basis for conclusions, which is available. Of course, application guidance available as an appendix to Ind AS 110. The basis for conclusion is also available, and that gives a lot of information on how control has to be applied, how control has to be tested, all those things, right? So that is to me, for my personal opinion, is that is a very well drafted accounting literature that is available, compared to the literature that is available to other standards in this entire framework. The guidance, application guidance on the basis for conclusion that is available for IFRS 10 is really adequate, and there are a lot of materials that is available, and that is a compulsorily read for all of us. Let us go through that. In this presentation, I am not covered the entire requirements of whatever is there in the base for conclusion. This not like exhaustively covered whatever aspects that is there. There are a lot of materials, almost 120 pages of material that is there. So that will give a more detailed understanding of how the control needs to be applied. We have just captured those few points wherein we can get an idea, and then of course it's a must read the application guidance that is there annexed to the respective accounting standards. To start with, the entity who has more than one or more subsidiaries, which is called as a parent, must consolidate and prepare a consolidated financial statements. And the exceptions, an entity who need not present a consolidated financial statements, though it has subsidiaries, is when it's a wholly owned subsidiary of another company or an partly owned subsidiary, where the owners of the companies, including those who are not entitled to vote, have been informed that the consolidated financial statements is not being made, and neither the securities of the shares or securities of the company are publicly traded or has an intention to come and publicly trade. And another critical criteria is that its parent, which it's of course we saw that it's a wholly owned subsidiary or a partly owned subsidiary of another company. Its parent publishes the Ind AS compliant financial statements that are available to public, wherein the idea is that the financial statements, the assets and liabilities of this company, which is not reporting the consolidated financial statements, it's also been consolidated into that financial statement, and which is available for the public to understand the financial position, to understand and take decision on whether investing or not in these companies. So the critical part of this standard is on assessing control and testing what application, what guidance that is there, and what are the steps that someone should take to assess the control, to assess whether an entity is being controlled by the other entity. Compared to what literature that is available globally and what was there in the earlier accounting regime, all those things, now it's a single consolidation model available to all entities. It's a single consolidation model, including all structured entities, and the principle based on which the single consolidation model is being applied is power so as to benefit model. To call it shortly, it is power so as to benefit. It has three criteria, which we will see as we move along. But it's a single consolidation model for all entities, and the basis for assessing and evaluating the control is power so as to benefit. So important thing is in the standard to understand on the what is the definition of control, right? So there are three conditions, and all those three conditions have to be satisfied. All those three conditions have to be satisfied. It's not 1 out of 3. All those three conditions have to be satisfied. The investor controls an entity when they have power over the investee. This is not there here in this slide. It's been covered in the next slide. Other than those power, the investor is exposed to the variable returns from this investment and has an ability, and this is again this is, as I told you, these three conditions have to be satisfied, and has an ability to affect those returns, so that the first is he gets a variable return, and he has a power, and the ability to affect those returns as well. So investor, first there are three conditions. One is whether the investor has the power over the investee, and whether he's been exposed to variable return from those investment, and whether he has an ability and uses its power that is there over the investee to affect those returns, right? We can say use cases for these three. As we move forward, we can have a detailed discussion on these 3 points. So these 3 points, these 3 conditions are very critical. So only these first condition out of that is power over the investee. So what is power over an investee? How do you conclude that an entity has a power over other entity, right? So simple all along what we have been taught from olden days is the voting rights that we have on the entity. Say if you have more than 50% voting rights, it means that you are controlling, right? So here the definition of control is not simply the voting rights. It is little more, as you know, the entire IFRS or Ind AS is based on substance over form. So the power over the investee can be exercised based on its current ability to direct relevant activities. His current ability, it is not out of any rights that is going to acquire in future. While you evaluate on the date, while you evaluate for that period, we have to evaluate such that it has a current ability to direct the relevant activities. So what are those relevant activities? Relevant activities are those that affect its return out of those investment. Those are relevant activities. It can be like, determining the operating policies of the company, appointing the key managerial person, taking a decision on, how to fund the company. So all those decisions, for example, typically these are the decisions that the shareholders of the company take. Shareholders of the company, the people who are those trusted with the management and the executive responsibilities of the company. These are those decisions taken, typically those decisions which these people take. And the investor, the entity that we are testing, whether it has a control over the other entity or not, should have that current ability to direct the relevant activities, right? This current ability come out of the rights with the entity, the investment entity has with the investee, what rights they have. So we'll move along as we see what are those rights and how to test those. So this is first condition that we saw is on the power over the investee. Just to recap, it is the ability to direct the relevant activities which affects their returns. Second is on the whether they are exposed to variable returns from the such involvement or from such investments. So return may include typically a return may include a dividend remuneration that they get, or any other form of returns that they get from the company. And in certain cases, it may also include maybe a case where the entity sells the entire output to another entity. So it means that the prices are determined, the entire output is being sold to the entity. So those kind of returns, which is in the normal parlance, what we understand as a dividend and remuneration, but other than that also there can be returns. So everything has to be taken into consideration to determine what first we have to understand what are those returns that this entity is getting out of those investments, and then try to understand whether these returns are variable and the investor is exposed to a variable return from this investment. Third critical thing is on ability to use the power. The first point we saw is power over the investee. Second is the exposure to variable returns. And third is the power that he has over the investee. He should have the ability to affect the returns, right? So first point is on the, just to recap, first point is on the power over the investee. Second is on the exposure to variable returns from that investment he should have. And with that power, he should be able to affect the return. It's not that he is a passive investor. I am also a passive investor holding 50 shares in a listed company. I also getting a variable return based on company's performance. That's not the case. So he should have the ability to affect the return that is getting out of that investment. So this power, what we are telling, the ability they may get due to, say, their voting rights, due to their rights to appoint key managerial personnel, so rights to appoint certain critical contracts for the company. So the major decisions of investment, funding, all those things. These are the cases where there is a ability to use the power to affect the returns. These are the cases where they affect the returns. You decide on the operational policies of the company, the strategies of the company. That's where you have the ability to affect the returns. So we are clear with these three criteria. We'll move ahead. So just to recap, first we have to identify what are those activities that significantly affect the return. Just if you start, say, if you're evaluating a relationship between the entity A and entity B, we have to understand from an investee perspective, first, what are those activities that the entity is carrying out which affects its return, right? So in those activities, once you have identified those activities can be operating policies, how you fund it, the capital structure, the decision on the key managerial personnel, all those things. So once you have decided those activities which significantly affect the return, then you move along to evaluate who has the power to control those activities. It's not like if you see, there are three conditions, and the evaluation, practically the evaluation starts from the investee while we identify what are those activities at the investee level, then move on to understand whether those activities that the investee has identified that it affects the results, who is controlling those, who has the ability to control those activities, and from there what are the returns that the entity which is controlling those, which has the ability to control those decisions getting. So the evaluation happens, practically the evaluation happens from the identifying the activities going up to the returns, and these three conditions are being evaluated such that you have you assess that whether the entity A is controlling entity B or not. As I told you, the returns, while you evaluate, it's not only the dividends and the remuneration. Returns may also be in terms of synergies that you get out of this entity, and the entire marketing responsibilities on, say, the one of the shareholders. So there are various conditions that needs to be taken into account, not in single, but in combination. In combination, it's not like somebody has this ability to appoint a key managerial personnel, which means that he controls. So there are so many rights that may be activities that may be undertaken by the company, by the investee, and all those activities have to be listed and see that what are the controls and through what, how is the control that is happening, who is taking this decision. For example, appointment of key managerial personnel, the decision is taken by the say by the board or by the shareholders. So at that time, the control has the ability to affect the decision, whether this person has the ability to affect those decisions. For example, operating policies may be taken at the managerial level, not at the board level or at maybe at the shareholders level. So those decisions, whether these people are appointing those key managerial personnel such that they are affecting the operational policies, right? So we have to not only identify the activities, or also identify at what level these decisions are taken, and at each level what control does this entity has, what role does this entity has to play, such that it can affect those activities such that they get those returns, right? This is an entire control power so as to benefit model. This is the most critical thing in that. So assessing control, how do you assess a control? How do you assess a control, right? There are enough application guidance. As I told you, the material that is there for this standard is almost 100-page material, which is there, which is a single Bible for this entire application of these standards. So assessing control. So as a first step, we have to consider what is the purpose and the design of the entity that you are evaluating, right? What is the purpose and design? In what there's an investee which is being tested, whether it's been controlled by another entity. So we have to consider what is the purpose and what is the design. How are they structured in terms of, say, shareholding or in terms of controlling the decisions? How are they structured? Second is identify the activities at the investee level. As we saw earlier, identify the relevant activities which affects his return. So identify those relevant activities at the investee level, and who is taking the decisions about those relevant activities. Maybe there are certain decisions made at the board level. Who is determining, and what are the rights that the investor has to affect those decisions and the returns that he is getting based on those decisions that he is taken, based on which we have to assess whether an entity is controlled by the other entity or not. We'll see this in detail. So while you identified the purpose and the design, again, we have to see what are those relevant activities, how the decisions are made, and whether they have the current ability and whether they receive the return from those activities. So the power over the investee that we have talked about so much, the power over the investee, right? So power over the relevant activities, the decisions that's being taken, and the control that the entity exercises on those return, the power that's been used to affect those variable returns such that the return increases for the investor. So all those things are power. And how does an entity get the power? These powers is based on its voting rights, which is a simple plain vanilla case, maybe a contractual arrangement. For example, in a case where there's entity A, still he holds only 40%. Still he has a veto power on all decisions made by the company. He is controlling entity A, though he has only 40%, which is by voting rights, he is not the major shareholder, but still he controls the entire decision making because he has the veto power. So it's not necessary that voting rights is the only indication. The rights may also come out of contractual arrangements. Contractual arrangements are predominantly those the founding documents, the shareholders agreement, to put in a simple parlance, the shareholders agreement, where the rights among the shareholders are being agreed between the shareholders. Say who has to vote on what, whether Mr. X vote is critical. He's without his vote, certain type of resolutions cannot be passed. So we have to understand the contractual arrangements as well while we determine whether there is a power over the investee or not. Then coming to the potential voting rights. So maybe they don't, there are entities we have, say, hold some 40%, 45%, still they have a right to procure or to acquire another 20% shareholding from the company. So while we consider the voting rights, we should also consider the potential voting rights which are available to the entity on today as on date of registration. It's not like future another 2 years later they get, but today the potential voting rights today, if that right is exercised today, whether what will be the voting rights and what will be the control that the entity will have on the investee. So that has to be evaluated as if the potential voting rights or actual voting rights. We have to the whatever is there on date. Here there are 2-3 critical things that's there in the standard. One is on the while you evaluate the potential voting rights, we should also see it's not that it has to be exercised as on date. Maybe for example, XYZ has a option to purchase those shares at 50 rupees, right, from the company, but still the market price is 30. Still he's not, logically he's not going to exercise because it's underwater, right? So whether we should consider those potential voting rights as well as if those shares are being available today, the answer is yes. We have to consider. It's the while we consider the potential voting rights, it's not about the ability of the organization to exercise those rights, whether it has the financial muscle power to exercise, but still the voting rights have to be considered which are available on that date, assuming that these voting rights will get exercised. What will be the control or what will be the impact, the power, the right that the entity will have over the investee. So from a rights perspective, there are no protective rights need not be considered. For example, we'll see in the subsequent slides, a protective right is one, it's not the intention of the organization, the investor to control that organization, but the rights that he has on the organization, the investee organization, is just to protect its financial interest or its involvement into the company. The intention is not to control the investee, but to protect the exposure that the investor has in the investee. Right. So relevant activities that we have been talking, we saw that control over relevant activities. What are those relevant activities? What are those operating and financing activities that typically form part of the relevant activities? So these are selling and purchasing of goods, the decision on the investments that has to be made, the kind of assets that has to be acquired, the product, how to approach in the market, what funding structure that we need to do, right? And also on the capital decisions, how do we want to fund it? It should be funded by a bank loan or it should be funded by a long-term loan. And also appointing the key managerial personnel who are going to discharge the functions of the management, and whether you have the right to remunerate them, you have the right to terminate them, right? So these are these relevant activities that needs to be considered. So right of power, as we saw, voting rights more than half, Yes, voting rights more than half. Yes, gives them a control in a plain Manila situation. Forget the contractual rights that somebody may have. In a situation where, in a general situation where somebody has voting rights more than half, yes, he controls the entity. Less than half, but with contractual rights, yes, again, there are contractual rights which gives him that control, though he is less than 50%, gives him that control to affect the returns of the entity. More than half he has, but still it's only a protective right. For example, say banks, the lenders who have converted their loans into a share capital, and though they hold 60%, their interest is only to the extent of the financial exposure that they have in this organization. So more than half, but still only protective. It may not give a control. These are, of course, these are not statements of say fact telling that this is how it is. These are not rules. Of course, there are various other conditions that we have to take into consideration. For example, rights. While we discuss the contractual rights, for example, say less than half, but as contractual rights. So rights can be of different types, right? Rights can be of potential voting rights, or to appoint management personnel, or to have veto power on any of the funding decisions, right? All those decisions, all those rights that is there has to be considered in combination with the proper weightage to understand who has that contractual right and who has the power, right? It's not, maybe there are certain, different, depends on case to case, it differs, right? There will be cases where he can appoint a KMP, but maybe termination is not there, right is not there with the shareholder. Maybe he can veto a funding decision, maybe, but he cannot do the operating activities like marketing or any other price fixation or any capital decisions. He will not be able to do. So it can be a different combinations of various rights that each of the shareholders have. So all those things have to be considered to evaluate whether the right of power is there and it's being exercised to affect those returns. Of course, we saw the voting rights in standalone, in its independent. It's not independently a determining factor. It has to be read with the contractual rights. For example, somebody holding 40% may still have the right to determine the product pricing, right to determine the funding structure, to appoint the KMPs, to decide on the operating policies, all those things which has to be considered. And not in individual, in aggregation, to see who has that control. Of course, the investor should not only be a passive investor. So there's a special relationship that any investor has with the investee. For example, the KMPs of the investee is being appointed by the investor or former employees of the investor, right? The technology that the investor has is being used by the investee, right? So which determines its output, the product, the returns as a result, right? So a significant portion of the investee is a portion is where you use the input products from the other company, the investor company. So your price and your price and your marketing to the outside world is based on the inputs that you get. So all those things, these, though you don't have a shareholder, these are indicators where you have more than a passive interest in the entity. Maybe you hold only 10%, but still you control the entire output of the entity, which means that you have a more than a passive interest in the entity, and you have to test, including the other factors, to consider whether the entity is being controlled by the investing entity. Consider only substantive rights and not productive rights. For example, we recently came in a case where as per the Electricity Act, somebody has to invest, say, 26% of equity in that company, which is developing the electricity and producing and supplying it to on a captive basis. So your interest is only on getting the electricity power from the developing company, but not on taking decisions on how you want to run the operations of the plant, all those things. The investment is done because as per statute, you have to hold that 26%, which is more of a protective right than a substantive right. Same is the case of bankers who convert their loans into shares, or they also invest into the without having shares. They also take, they have to be considered for certain key decisions that the company takes. All those things are protective rights. So we have to consider whether to understand whether a right is a substantive right or a protective right. We have to understand what is the end of the day, what is that the investor is going to achieve, what is the substance that the investor is going to achieve with that right, and to understand whether that right, whether that right is being exercised by him to take care of his interests, the exposure that he has, or to affect the returns that he is getting from the investing. Right. So protective rights, as we saw, it can be arising out of a lending document where the bank has the right to take decisions on the capital, on the dividend declaration. So those things, the bank, the fresh issue of equity, fresh dilution, the bankers may have that right. So we have to see, while we evaluate those rights, we have to see whether it is protective or substantive. So here comes another typical case which is being discussed in the standards is of the franchisees, right? Franchisees, wherein there may be brands which are being held by, say, we have all those brands which are being held by the brand just here. There's one question which has come in. We'll take from Mr. Amit Kumar Jain, whether a nominee director will be treated as KMP and therefore having substantive right to influencing control over the investee. Mr. Amit, it's like this. See, a nominee director can be treated as he will not be treated as an KMP, because a nominee director comes in with this nominee directorship. We have to see what is the, how does he gets that nominee directorship. For example, is it he getting the nominee director because of a lender, say, coming in, say he is lent say 500 crores, 1,000 crores, so he gets a nominee director in that case, or from an RBI or statutory perspective where he comes in as a nominee director. In such cases, he will not be considered as a KMP. It's based on the function. Of course, this is not based on designation that he is a nominee director, doesn't mean, but we have to see what are those underlying documents that gives them the right to be a nominee director. And see, in general cases, nominee directors will not be treated as KMP, and there may not be a substantive right that they have, because my understanding is from a case where a nominee director is coming out because he wants to control his interest in this company, so he is coming. So he will not be treated as a KMP, nor influencing the control over the entity so as to have that substantive rights. My assumption on a general case, the assumption is he will have a, he's trying here to protect his right rather than to have a rather than to impact the returns of the organization. So on the let's move on to franchisees. So what happens here? There are some brands where, for example, say there is a XYZ brand which is available globally, where it is being brought to India, and there are entities which supply those products under those brands. We have seen all those brands which are there. So what happens here is the brand owner determines how the product has to be sold, how the, in fact, we have seen cases where the product owner determines how the showroom should be, at what price you should sell, what is the service that you should do. All those things are being decided by the franchisee and decided by the franchisor who is giving that right, So he may have he may take a decision to tell that this product has to be marketed this way, this should be the price. So that's not the decision of the company. So here the question comes, there was globally there have been standards that are issued under US GAAP, under other various accounting literature as well, where this has been discussed in detail. So what the So we have to understand what is the relationship, what is the document that they have, how is the arrangement between the franchisor and the franchisee. Generally, what happens in such cases is that the franchisor is more interested in his product being to that quality and being to that service levels. So he is not interested in the returns of the franchisee, whereas franchisee is trying to, his interest would be to get a return out of those products which has been assigned to him by the franchisor. So you have to see what is the intention in the general case. In a plain vanilla case, what happens is the franchisor is interested in his product and the return that he gets, which may be or may not be variable, but the franchisee as such is interested in his business. The franchisor's interest is not in the profitability of the franchisee, but is on selling its product, having his marketability, and the brand that he has built. His interest in that is more not on the franchisee's return that the franchisee gets. So in a general case, what happens in such franchisee's agreement is that we can conclude that there cannot be a control unless he also affects the return, and he also gets the share of those profits, and he also participates in the operating decisions, and he also participates in those relevant activities that we saw. In general case, what happens is that he is more interested on the return that he gets out of his product, and the franchisee is more interested on the profit that he makes from this business of selling these products. So there are enough guidance material that is available on how a franchisee agreements are, that typically what are those clauses and how it will be evaluated, all those things. The application guidance has a detailed coverage on this. So while we evaluate control under different scenarios, right? Assuming a simple control due to the voting rights, anything with less than 50%, still an entity can control the other entity, not necessary that the voting is the single criteria, as we saw. Critical things that we have to consider while you evaluate this voting rights. Maybe there are various other rights, but while you evaluate the voting rights, the critical thing that you have to consider is the size of the holding, and not only the size of the holding of the investor, but on the other investees as well. For example, there is a investor who holds 40%. The other investees, other investors in this company who is holding balance 60% are so dispersed that not even there is one person who is more than 1%, right? So the control is being, we can based on other conditions as well, but from a voting rights perspective, we can conclude that there is a control which this person is exercising over the entity, because the other shareholders are so dispersed that they cannot come into a single forum and take a decision. This person, investor, controls 40% of the voting rights. So in such cases, it can be assumed that there is a control of this investor over the investee. We saw the potential voting rights and also the other contractual rights which have to be considered in line with the existing voting rights. We have to adjust those voting rights to have the impact of those potential voting rights and what contractual rights they have, and then determine whether there is a control over the entity or not. We have to have other conclusive evidences as well, right? For example, though we by seeing all these things, somebody holds 40% and balance 60% are held by dispersed shareholders. So while you determine whether this person controls or not, we should see how it has happened. What was the voting pattern in the previous board meetings or in the previous shareholders meeting? How the voting pattern has happened? Is it like this person has voted and other 60% have been dispersely voting for against? So how is it, or is it that those 60% have been able to come to a common conclusion and been voting, or how the voting has happened in the previous board meeting? That's also very critical thing to consider to evaluate the control, whether the control is there or not. So there are two cases here. I'll take you through the cases. we can have the responses, request the participants to have this response over the chat box, right? Sorry. So entity A, who owns 45% of the shares of entity B. Entity A is the largest shareholder, as we saw. It has the right to appoint the majority of the members of the board, and there has been special rights which is given to entity A in the founding document. So in this case, what will entity A be considered as controlling entity B? Yeah. So obviously, yes. So this is a case where entity A would be controlling entity B. Subject to that, it's not like in a bank or a financial institutions, as Mr. Amit was asking. So that there will be a requirement giving power to appoint those directors, right? In case of banks or financial institutions, except for in those cases, this will be a case where there will be, we can assume that from this example, that given the facts, that there will be a control of entity A or entity B. So here again, entity A and B have 50% ownership in a trust. Here, what has happened is, in the founding document, they have segregated the rights, that entity A appoints the manager of the trust, and the manager is responsible for managing the assets of the trust, how to run the trust, what are those operating policies that is there, and he cannot be removed without a cause. So here there cannot be a single fit answer. So what we have to identify, what are those activities that the investee entity is doing, and who directs those activities. Maybe there may be a decision which is being taken by B also, but the general understanding is the appointment of manager, right? The KMP, appointing a KMP is with entity A, and KMP has the entire right to do all those activities. In a simple plain vanilla case, we can conclude that entity A is being controlling, though it has 50-50, though it's a case of a joint control, but entity A is controlling the appointment of KMP and its activities. So it can be concluded that entity A is controlling the trust, but still, of course, other factors needs to be considered while deciding on this control. Potential voting rights with respect to potential voting rights, the potential voting rights gives an investor additional voting rights other than what they have today, and we have to consider what will be the voting rights of the investee on a fully diluted basis, including those potential voting rights that the investor has. So while you consider the potential voting rights, also consider what are those conditions which are attached to the potential voting rights, and what is the possibility, or what is the reality that the potential voting rights can be excised, and the investor company has the rights, acquires additional rights over the investee. While you consider potential voting, it's not like all potential voting rights are dilutive and gives them the right. So we have to consider what are those conditions under which the potential voting rights have to be exercised, and whether in reasonable certainty that the investor has, and the condition is such that the investor can exercise those potential voting rights and increase its control over the entity. So for example, company owns 49% of the stock, and currently they have an exercisable option. Currently the option is exercisable. If they want, they can exercise to additional 2%. For example, now we have concluded this, once there is a 51%, the entity controls, for example, given the other facts. So, but the purchase of those stock is at $50, whereas valued at $30. So it is under the money. So what happens? Entity A, though it's under the money, but there are no restrictions on barriers on entity A to go and acquire those shares. So it's not that because he's going to acquire those shares, he's going to incur a loss, so he may not acquire, so there is no potential voting rights. We have to consider whether the right is there, and even if it is at under the money, whether he has the right and whether the right is accessible today, this will be considered into the potential voting rights and considered while evaluating the control, regardless of assuming that there is no other conditions and no other barriers. Given this, in this case, there will be control which is there by company A on company B. So this is agency relationships which are there. So there may be cases where the rights are exercised not directly by the investor, by the agency. And while evaluate that, we have to see the control exercised by that entity on the investee, whether it's doing on its own for its interest and for its return, or for the interest or returns of the principal who has appointed this agent. So we have to see on how is the entity that is taking the decision being compensated, and what is the scope of decision making authority that they have, whether they themselves make those decisions, or the decisions are made by the other entities, and these people only carry out those decisions. We have to see those things in full and understand what is the relationship between the person who is taking the decision and the so-called tested entity for agency relationship and the investee. So we have to find who is the exact owner, and who has that control, and who has to consolidate this financial statement. There are enough guidance material that's been provided on this agency relationships. For example, this is one of the examples where there's one entity which is a responsible entity, which takes the broad decision making powers, and it's been remunerated while through a market based fee. Its equity interest is only 20%. So we have to see, based on these cases, whether it's acting as an agent. With example, what we mean by acting as an agent is that whether the decision is being taken by that entity, or is it that the decisions are being taken by some other entity and they have only power to represent in the board and convey those decisions, and what is the remuneration and the market based fee that the agency guy, the tested guy, is getting. Is he getting a return from the entity, a variable return, which means that he has the control, or is he getting only a market based fee based on which he will be treated as an agency? Of course, one slide on these investment entities. With this, we conclude the control portion. One slide on the investment entities is when there are structured entities who obtain the funds, the investments from the investors, and they do an investment management services. They invest in turn in other entities and earn a return out of that, and give it to those investors who have invested in this company. And because that they invest in these entities, the measurement for them is not based on the consolidation model. They need not consolidate. They need to measure these investments at fair value through profit or loss, and measure these investments on a fair value basis. This is the exception to the rule that we saw, wherein a person who has an subsidiary has to consolidate, except for those investment entities. Again, to determine whether an entity is an investment entity, right? Say, for example, a CAC, where it's going to invest in other entities, it can be treated as an investment entity. So we are determining whether the investment entities, whether the real investment management services are being carried out. For example, there may be two people who come together, and through that investment, they are investing in other entities. We have to see whether there is an investment management services that somebody is carrying out by getting in the funds, and whether the decisions of investing and the returns that they get from that entities are being taken by the investment management services company and then distributed to the investors. We have to exercise all those judgments and assumptions, and try to arrive at whether first test whether it's an investment entity. And once it passes this test, then the condition is that they need not consolidate and measure those investments at fair value through profit or loss. With this, we conclude the first portion of Ind AS 110, which is on the control and the judgments and how to assess control, all those things. Just to recap, the three golden rule of assessing control is power over the investee, and to get the variable return from that, and being able to exercise those power to get those variables return. While you evaluate the power, we have to see what are those rights that has been attached, and consider only the substantive rights or not the productive rights, and also consider the potential voting rights to arrive at what is the exact rights that's been which is being impacted by the investor. Identify the relevant activities, see who's taking the decisions on those relevant activities, what is the return that the investor gets, based on which assess what is the whether the investee is being controlled by the investor or not. So this is a short summary of what we have seen until now. We can pause here for 2-3 minutes to see if there are any thoughts from the team. Arun Kumar, what is that slide number, Arun Kumar? I'm not getting the earliest. Huddle. Hello? I'm audible, Arun?
Yes, sir, you are audible.
Okay. Delegated rights. You want what you're asking here? So here, what happens, Arun, here? The broad decision-making power. See, there's one. This assume that this entity A and this entity B, and these are being here. There is an investment trust, and they are investing in the portfolio. So here, what we have to see is responsible entity. It makes the decision-making power of the trust. For example, appointing a trustee, and it has the right to manage this trust. So the remuneration of this entity will be maybe based on market fee, the investment trust. So here we have to understand whether this entity has delegated this right to the investment trust based on what decision making this entity is going to appoint the trustees here, and going to get remunerated based on the market fee. So we have to understand, we have to evaluate whether, irrespective of the shareholding that the responsibility has in the trust or the interest that the responsible entity may have, whether the responsible entity, which is say entity A, is controlling the any of these companies in the investment portfolio, or for example, even the investment trust as well. So while we consider that control, assess that control, we have to see whether which entity appoints the investment trust, and what are those rights of the trustees that is there, and what is the return that the trustee is getting, what is the return that the entity who is appointing is getting, such that we determine who is controlling the investment portfolio which is there. So while this equity interest, this is not a hurdle rate, just we are given in this equity interest of 20% for the reason that it is not 50%. It is just a 20%, a simple 20% which is there, but still it has the right to appoint the trust, and it has the right to appoint the trustees, take decisions. Then it will be considered as a control. This is not a hurdle rate. This is the shareholders. This is the shareholding that it has. So there is, in case of fund managed by a fund manager, will the fund manager be exercising control over the fund as per 110 by virtue of power in managing the trust funds? What is the criteria to decide whether there is a control or not? So what happens here, Mr. Rajiv? Here, what happens is, as we saw, there are 3 conditions which has to be satisfied simultaneously. Of course, the power over the investee, and the returns that you get, which has to be variable, and third is the power, using that power, he has the ability to affect those variable returns, right? Here, if you ask for a fund manager, there are we have to see whether these three conditions satisfy in full, right? One, power over the investee, whether he has power over the investee or whether he is a fund manager. He has power over the investments, right? We understand he has power over the investments, whether he has power over the investee, whether he can take decisions. A fund manager can take decisions. He can obviously take decisions on where to invest, but whether he can take decisions on kind of appointing other KMPs, whether he can take a decision on how to fund it, what returns has to be given, what dividends have to be given. So whether he has that right to take it, we have to see. Generally, fund manager will be an investment manager who will have rights to invest its funds and create that target returns that he is targeting. So he may not as such have control over the investee, but he may have control over the investments which the investee has made. So first point. Second point is whether he's been getting a variable return from the investments that he's making. Whether his remuneration, for example, the fund manager's remuneration, whether it is entirely based on the return that he's making out of those investments, right? Maybe he's an employee of that fund, or he manages, whether his entire return is based on what he's doing from that fund. It may not be a case, right? It may not be a case. The entire return out of those funds, the variable returns will go to the investors who have put in money, who has given him that money. He may not get that variable return. He may get obviously say a 10% variable return, 20% variable return, but the entire variable return is of the investors. And second thing, whether he has the power to manage those funds, to manage those with the rights, whether he is affecting those returns. Of course, he has rights. He has rights because he is changing portfolios to create the returns. But only thing is whether that right that he has is within the framework approved by the investors. He is not going to take a decision. A fund manager will not take a decision outside the framework that's been given. Say, for example, he can take a decision of investing in X amount in this fund, this type of fund. Say in a blue chip funds, you can invest say 30%. Those kind of broad investment decisions. We are here talking about rights in the sense the broad investment decisions. Those broad investment decisions will be taken by the investors or the board which is there, and given to the investors management, within which these fund managers operate and get the returns for those investors. So even the third conditions in a general plain case, I don't think a fund manager will be deemed to have the control over the investee. He has control over the investments that the investee makes, but not necessarily over the investee. Is it right? Clarified, Mr. Rajeev? Anyone else? Maybe we can wait for a minute. Sure. And so we'll move on to the consolidation aspect, the accounting aspect of this. The principles of consolidation, of course, this is we have seen this consolidation, how it needs to be done from our say CA final times. So consolidation at parent level, consolidate all those entities into a single economic activities. apply uniform accounting policies across all the subsidiaries. For example, there are cases where the standard provides for an option, right? For example, you may recognize this through fair value, or you can recognize through cost. So for that type of investments, while it's consolidated, apply a uniform accounting policies across those entities which are being consolidated. Same reporting period, of course. It has to be same reporting except for a few exceptions we will see later. Eliminate the intra-group balances, whatever is the intercompany balances, the investments that it has versus the equity here, and also separate the non-controlling interest that is there in each of these subsidiaries. Non-controlling interest, just for clarity, it's the that portion of the equity on the entity which you control, which belongs to the third party, which belong to the other than the reporting entities. The consolidation shall begin from the date that the investor obtains control and ceases on the day when the investor loses the control. Right? It should start on the day while you assess the control. We should also determine the day on which the entity got control on the investee. From that day, the consolidation should begin, and to stop on the day that while you assess that there is no more control over the entity. We have to combine like items, and it's a line by line addition. The assets to assets, a line by line addition, and offset the carrying amount of investment in each subsidiary. Eliminate intra-group transactions. Of course, I think we have done this. On the reporting date to be the same as that of the parent and subsidiary, unless there is impracticable situations wherein you're not able to say there is a foreign subsidiary who has an accounting period of January to December. In such cases, it permits up to a 3-month lag. For example, the financial statements of a parents are as of March. Maybe you can take a financial statements which is 3 months earlier, but of the same period, the accounting periods has to be of the same number of months, that you can consolidate into the parent. If subsidiary year requires an adjustment, for example, during that period of December, Jan, Feb, March, the time that's a lag in which the financial statements are not being prepared for the subsidiary. In case there is a significant event that has happened in the subsidiary which will impact the group, or the parent in a material way, we have to the consolidated financial statements has to account for those differences as well. So, for example, a simple case wherein A Limited has a March end and B Limited has a December end. Due to March market conditions, January, there have been a significant portion of the assets of B Limited are being impaired. And from a consolidation perspective, on a group perspective, it's a material amount. So it has to be given effect in the consolidated financial statements of the parent company. So there can be cases where the accounting policies are different across the subsidiaries from the parent. As far as practicable, you have to adjust those, give effect to those changes in the accounting policies, and adjust the financial statements of the subsidiaries, and then consolidate into the consolidated financial statements. Of course, as a standalone, those subsidiaries can follow their own accounting policies, but while it has been consolidated, the adjustments have to be made for those changes in accounting policies, which differs from that of the parent. Non-controlling interest. So we have to the non-controlling interest to be accounted from the date of acquisition as a part of the business combination, and the share of net profit or loss that the non-controlling interest has at every accounting period has to be disclosed separately as a single line item, So if the subsidiary has an outstanding cumulative preference shares which are being classified as equity and that are being held by the non-controlling interest parties, so we have to compute the share of profit or loss after adjusting for those dividends on those shares. Whether the dividends are declared or not declared, we have to account for those dividends, adjust the profit, and then prepare the consolidated financial statements and including those dividends and those adjustments. The changes in, of course, the changes in non-controlling interest can be directly affected in equity.
Okay, leave the meeting. End the meeting for all, Putrava. End the meeting.
So, yeah. Sorry. If parent company ceases control and it no longer recognizes that that entity as a subsidiary, de-recognize all the assets and liabilities. In case there are some retained investments, say for example 50% retaining 10%, there's 10% to be valued at fair value based on Ind AS 109, and recognize all gain or loss which is associated with this loss of control. And the consolidated financial statements after you lose control these subsidiaries, the former subsidiaries, will not get consolidated into those consolidated financial statements, and any retained interest in those subsidiaries will be reported at fair value as per Ind AS 109. So there may be cases where the control is lost in multiple arrangements. For example, there's every 6 months, or there's a transaction wherein it is lost in phases. The control is lost in phases. So we have to, in such cases, we have to determine whether when does an entity lose that control, because we have to stop accounting for those entities control. So we have to understand when the entity is losing that control, and whether if there are multiple agreements, multiple arrangements, whether it has to be considered into a single arrangement and the loss of control to be evaluated. For example, there may be a single event which runs across a time period, for example 6 months, 1 year, or there may be multiple events in substance which have to be considered as a single event and then evaluated whether the control is lost or not. There are various examples that's been given in the application guidance. So there may be conditions where there are multiple arrangements entered into. Maybe the first arrangement is entered into in contemplation of the second arrangement, or it's been structured such that they are different arrangements, but the end result of that is to achieve a single goal of getting control over that entity. So those things have to be evaluated at the time of acquisition and also at the time of loss of control. These things have to be evaluated to see the date when the control has got, the date when the control has ceased to exist. So to arrive at these two dates, these these are done over multiple tranches, or in not in a single transaction but in a multiple transactions. These has to be evaluated in its full, holistically, these things to be evaluated. There may be conditions, maybe there are detailed guidance, as I told you. There may be conditions where one activity is economically not justified. It's not, there's no meaning, economic meaning is not there on one activity, and it is contemplating in another activity. So these are the indicators where we have to test these two arrangements, whether it's a single arrangement but still designed as two. These are the indicators where we have to test those arrangements and to understand whether there is a loss of control, and when is that loss of control, giving the fact to understanding the entire scenario here. With this, we conclude the Ind AS 110. If there are no queries here, we can stop for 1 minute. If there are no more queries here, we can move on with joint arrangements. Fine. We'll start off with joint arrangements in days 111. So again here, this again, the critical points here, of course, it's like this huge of a topic on the 110 on these consortium standards to be covered in 2 hours, but still we will do our best to see whether we can touch upon critical things. Here again, this standard defines what is a joint control, and the entity, those 2 entities which have joint control, all those entities which have joint control have to assess its rights and obligations and account for the joint arrangement based on the rights and obligations that the respective parties have. So here there are few judgments that has to be taken, given like what we saw in case of a control, like that there are few decisions, the judgments which has to be made given the what are the facts and circumstances of those joint arrangement, which we will see. Arrangement where there are 2 or more parties who have joint control or bound by the contractual arrangement that they have, and those contractual arrangement gives those 2 or more parties a joint control over that arrangement, right? Joint control, generally joint control means where the party, those 2 or more parties have who take decisions about that the joint arrangement with an unanimous consent. It's like everybody, all those 2 or more parties who are there in that scenario has an equal equal decision making power over that joint arrangement. In such cases, these are called as joint control. Of course, the standard defines it to mean where only decisions about relevant activities require unanimous consent. The relevant decisions, of course, the relevant activities or those that we saw earlier in 110, those relevant activities require unanimous consent of those parties. In such cases, those are cases where you can say that there are joint control, and these parties will account for that joint control based on the characteristics of the arrangement, which we will see. A joint control can either be a joint operation or a joint venture, right? So here what happens, the parties that have rights to the assets and obligation towards those liabilities, or when they are relating or joint operations, when they have right to the respective assets and to the respective liabilities. As against this, when they have rights to the net assets of the arrangement, it's not like they have rights to the individual assets or liabilities, but they have a right to the net assets of arrangement, then it becomes a joint venture. When they have a right to the individual assets and liabilities, then it becomes a joint operation. So what happens is, in a joint operation, why this judgment is very critical? We have to see the joint arrangement document between these parties to understand whether they have a right to the respective assets, to the individual assets, or to the liabilities, the obligation towards the liabilities, or is it that they don't have to the individual assets, but to the net asset, to the net investment, or to the net return that they get out of those operations, whether they have the rights to those. In such cases, it is a case of a joint venture, and it is being accounted based on equity method. But in case of a joint operation, the accounting is for the individual assets and liabilities by the respective parties who are jointly controlling that joint operation. They have to account for those assets, they have to account for those liabilities, because what they control is not the net asset, but what they have right to is the individual assets and the obligations of the liabilities. So determining whether a joint operation or a joint venture, and how the accounting depends. If it is a joint operation, they have to account for the respective assets and liabilities. If it is a joint venture, the accounting will be as per the using the equity method. Like you account an investee, it will be an associate, it will be through an equity method. So these application guidance has again detailed information on how the assessment has to be made, whether it's a joint operation or a joint control. Generally, what happens in case it is not structured through a separate vehicle, right? It is not structured through a separate vehicle. I have also put in assets in my books. He has also put in assets in his books, but there is a joint operation which is happening. In that case, what happens is it will be classified, that joint arrangement will be classified as a joint operation, because I have the rights to my assets, I have obligation towards my liabilities, and so does the other partner as well. So in cases where it is not structured through a separate vehicle, it will be a joint operation, and the respective parties will account for the assets and liabilities in its books. But in case it is structured through a separate vehicle, we have to understand what is the legal form of that vehicle and what contractual arrangement are there between these controlling parties, and how have they conducted the business. The other facts and circumstances on, though there is an agreement, though there is an legal form, there's a separate vehicle, how have they conducted their activities, how have they gone by the carrying on the activities in this joint venture. This is joint arrangement determines whether it's a joint venture or not. Maybe based on that, such when it is carried through a separate vehicle and there's a legal form and the contractual arrangement is there where it defines that the parties to the joint arrangement have the rights towards the net assets only. In such cases, it will be treated as a joint venture and it will be accounted using that investment will be accounted using the equity method, as in case of an associate. So what while evaluating, this is the critical evaluation. Of course, the accounting, while the joint arrangement, which is having a joint control, if it is accounted as a joint venture, it goes through the accounting as per the associate accounting, which that's a separate standard. Or if not, you account for the respective assets and liabilities. There is no complication on how it has to be accounted. I think there's enough guidance on how it has to be accounted. So here the critical thing is to test. Critical thing is to test whether it's a joint operation or a joint venture. So first test would be on the legal form, whether the party have the right to the assets and obligations or for the liabilities. The answer is yes. It's a joint operation. Parties have contractual rights to the contractual rights. First is the legal form, whether they have a legal right. Second is a contractual right to the assets and obligations. Still, they have in whichever form, whether they have in legal form or in terms of contract, whether if they have a right to the rights to the assets and obligation towards those liabilities, it becomes a joint operation. If not, the arrangement, we have to see what are the other factors that are there. How is the operation being conducted? Is it being conducted as if the which gives rights to the net assets, or the activities are conducted for their respective rights over the assets and obligations towards the liabilities. In such cases, it will be joint operations. Even if that condition is not there, this will become a joint venture and accounted based on the equity method. So here there are two cases. So one is a separate vehicle is being established over which two parties have joint control. The purpose of the joint arrangement is to construct and sell residential units. There neither the legal form nor contractual terms give the parties right to the assets or obligations for the liabilities arrangements. They have contributed equity and they also raised debts. The sale proceeds, the whatever is remaining after repaying the debts, these people share between these two arrangements. So in such cases, whether it will be a joint operation or a joint venture. So people can, participants can reply in the chat. It will be a joint venture. Sure. It will be accounted for as a joint venture. So moving on to the next example. So here what happens, P and Q jointly establish a company over which they have joint control. The P and Q will purchase all the output produced by S such that the pricing will be such that S that covers only for its production cost for automation overhead. It only breaks even, and they take the respective shares. So say this person takes 60%, that person takes 40%. This is a typical example where the idea is not to get the returns from yes, but the idea is to have access to the respective assets, respective resources of those as the company yes. So in such cases, this will be a joint operation. It will be a joint operation. So there was one question in between. What is the equity method in joint control? See, equity method we will come while we discuss the investment in associates. We will come towards that equity method. Equity method, it's when at the time of acquisition of the associate, right? Associate or the joint venture, the method of accounting is equity method, which is the same. You recognize it as at the fair value, and then whatever the attributable profit that comes to the associate or to the joint venture, you keep on adding to that, and it's presented as a single line item in the balance sheet. You will see it while we discuss in IAS 28 on associate. The next chapter, right? We'll move on to Ind AS 28, which is on investment in associate and joint ventures. I think we have half an hour more. Fine, we'll try to complete. So certain definitions, of course, the down below items is on the joint arrangement. Joint control we saw a little while back. A joint arrangement is where two or more parties have joint control, and joint control can either be a joint venture or can be joint operations. Again, in this standard, it mentions accounting for two things. One is on associates and joint venture, where both are accounted on equity method. An associate is when an entity has a significant influence as against control. It's not control, the significant influence over the investor entity. Significant influence is a power to participate in the financial operating policy decisions of the investee, but it is not control. It's a power to participate, but not to. It's as against a control where it is a power to influence the return and to benefit from the variable returns of the organization. It's not control. It is a significant influence. That is the difference between the control and significant influence. While there was a question on the equity method, whereby investment is initially recognized at cost and then adjusted for whatever profits that the entity earns, and what is the investor share of that profit is adjusted for those profits and gets reinstated every accounting period. So Ind AS 28, it should be applied by all entities where there are all investors who have joint control or significant influence over another investee. Exemption to that is to those venture capital funds, mutual funds, where the investments are held at designated fair value through profit or loss, or classified as held for sale. And both these are accounted based on Ind AS 109. Other than that, all other entities should apply the standard when they have a joint control or significant influence over an investee. Again, significant influence, generally the understanding is that there's a presumption of 20% holding. Anything above 20% holding, including the potential voting rights, as we saw earlier, will be considered. And the presumption is that anybody holding more than 20% has a significant influence over the investee entity. It's neither a control, which is more than 50% holding, nor a joint control, which has an unanimous consent for all activities. So it is neither a control nor a joint control. It's a significant influence portion where we just participate in the financial decision making and the other operating policies of the investee. How does test whether someone has a significant influence over the investee? So maybe it may be through a representation in the board. Maybe there may be a person who is holding 30% shares may have one board seat, and maybe through a participation in the policy making decisions, including decisions about dividends, and there is an interchange of managerial person. The MD of this company becomes an MD of the other company. There's interchange of managerial person, and there is a technical information which is being provided by this company to the other company where it significantly influences the company's return. So in such cases, what happens is we have to evaluate all those cases and see what is the impact of those cases, and then decide whether there's a significant influence there or not. Of course, the more the assessing methodology for control versus significant influence does not change much. The same methodologies that we have to apply and see whether there's a significant influence that the entity has over the investee. So how does the investment, in case of, say, we conclude that it is it's an associate or it's a joint venture, how the accounting needs to happen? Accounting is initially the equity method, the investment is recognized as cost at the value that we invest, and then adjusted for the post-acquisition, whatever is the investor's share of the net assets of the associate or joint venture, it's been adjusted. And consolidation principles, it's the same as in 110. It is just a single line item that has been disclosed. And other than where equity method is not followed, in case of where it is held for sale, for example, an investment in associate is held for sale, it is not, equity method is not followed. There is you don't recognize the further the investor share of net assets. It is not recognized, and it is valued based on Ind AS 105. And such investments, the investments in associates, it's classified as non-current assets and disclosed for as a single line item in the statement of financial position or in the balance sheet. So in case the equity method not applying in the consolidated financial statements, this being carved out is there in the IFRS in Ind AS 28, where same conditions are being there, wherein the owners are being informed that this consolidation is not happening. The investor does not have a debt or an equity instrument which is being publicly traded. These conditions are there. In such cases, in Ind AS 28, there is an exemption telling that the equity method need not be applied. As we told, a presentation, it's a single line item that appears, which is the investor share of associate of joint ventures of profit in the ventures profit or loss. It's a single line item in the comprehensive income and a single line item in the investment in equity accounted investee in the statement of financial position or balance sheet. So what happens? Equity entity, say, assume in case of a loss, what happens? There is an investment which has been recognized at a cost to start with. Then there has been losses in the investee. So the investment's value gets eroded. And when it comes to zero, until it comes to zero, it has been recognized. And once it touches zero, we have to evaluate whether there is any additional loss incurred by the investee, whether there is any liability on the investor that it has to contribute for those losses. In such cases, it has to recognize those losses as well. And future profits, while after some years it turns profitable, the future profit, while it gets recognized, it has first we have to wipe out those losses, and then only after the future profits equal to the share of those losses which are accumulated losses are there. After that, the investment value is increased and the disclosure happens in the financial statements. Until then, if there's an obligation on the investor to contribute for those losses, it has to be recognized. If not, it should be carried at zero. Again, in the loss of significant influence over an entity, the equity method for accounting for this investment shall be discontinued, and the investment shall be accounted based on Ind AS 109. And in case there is a shall measure at fair value any investment that investor retains. For example, say you brought down investment from 30% to 5%, that remaining 5% will be treated as per Ind AS 109 as if it's a investment, is a financial instrument. While we lost, there is a loss of significant influence. The difference between the carrying value, what the investment, the value at which the investment is carried, and from the disposal, what is the return that the investor has got. It's been recognized in the P&L, and the amount earlier recognized in the income statements is also routed through to the investment in the balance sheet, and they are repurposed, and the net loss or profit is arrived and recognized in the financial statements. So at the time of investment, say there is a carrying value of that associate is say X rupees, and the investment which is more than the amount that is getting invested, which is more than the carrying value of the share of net assets and liabilities. The incremental value is treated as goodwill and is not amortized. It's carried as goodwill and tested for impairment. And in case the net assets or liabilities of the associate is more than the amount that's been invested, the share of net assets and liabilities, in such cases, it is accounted as capital reserve. This is a change which is there from Ind AS 28 to the the IAS 28 to the Ind AS. The reason that in IFRS, in Ind AS, as per Ind AS 28, the income is recognized, the difference is recognized in P&L, whereas in case of Ind AS, this is the carve out where the gain is being recognized in the capital reserve rather than in the P&L. Of course, the net investment in associate or in a joint venture, it's been tested for impairment. There are significant, there are enough indicators that is available and enough material available in Ind AS 36 to see whether how to test for impairment, what are the indicators of impairment, as if those procedures to be followed to see whether an investment in associate has been impaired or not. Disclosure. We have to, the disclosure requirements are there where it's a listed entity, where there are published price. In such cases, whether what is the published price that is for, we have to test whether what is the published price, what is the fair value of those investments, and a summary of financial information of associates. Say, though there's a single line item that is there in the P&L, there's a single line item that is there in the financial statement of financial position, a summarized financial information of the associates to be provided in the notes on accounts. And same like in consolidation, what is the accounting period that has been followed? Even in while you pick up the profit, your share of net assets and net, while you pick up the profit, you have to see whether the same accounting policy is being followed by the associate, and we have to see what are those differences, and based on which these profit have to be picked up, and also accounting statements. So while you pick up the profits, what is the accounting period that's been used by the associate, and what is the accounting period that the parent is consolidating those financial statements. We have to see, and same the consolidation procedures. Those part of those consolidation procedures needs to be followed. We have to disclose what is the nature and extent of significant restrictions on ability of the associate to transfer the funds, though we account it as an investment, and we also add to those the share of assets and liabilities that gets added every year in the associate. We have to see, also disclose what are those significant restrictions that is there for the company to realize that value, and what are the unrecognized share of losses in case of discontinuance of recognition, what are those losses? Say we have recognized, we have brought down the investments by writing it off to zero. So after that, what are those unrecognized share of losses that is there, which you feel that as an investor you are not obliged to contribute, and what are those unrecognized share of losses? And in case it is not accounted through equity method, which is not, there's no option here. In case it is not accounted, we have to see why it is not accounted. This more comes from an Ind AS 28 perspective. So this slide, little critical, where we saw 110 on the control and on Ind AS 28. We are trying to see how these speak with each other, right? So what happens? The evaluation mechanism, the assessment criteria is the same. Say you see whether there is a control. If there is, yes, there's a control, it gets accounted based on Ind AS 110, and there are disclosures based on Ind AS 112. And if there are no control, then you evaluate whether there's a joint control. So there's no single person controlling, but still, is it a case of a joint control? In that case, what happens? We evaluate whether it is a significant influence or it is a type of a joint arrangement. Once it's a type of joint arrangement, whether it is a joint operation or a joint venture. If it is a joint operation, you account for your respective share of assets and your obligation towards those liabilities and disclose based on Ind AS 112. If it is a joint venture, you account for the investment in accordance with Ind AS 28. And even if it is a significant influence, you account it based on as if equity method of accounting, you for joint venture and also for entities over which you have significant influence, and account it based on Ind AS 28 and disclosures as per 112. Even if there is no significant influence, account it based on Ind AS 109. So while you evaluate an investment which is there in the balance sheet, you evaluate based on whether there is a control, then see if there's a joint control, whether the joint control is a type of an arrangement, a joint arrangement or a significant influence, and account it based on that. Disclosure for all these conditions, disclosure based on Ind AS 112, and then it's not even a significant influence, not even a type of joint arrangement, then it becomes an investment as per Ind AS 109. The investment has to be valued based on the principles in those standards. This is a consolidated presentation of how these standards interact and what are those significant decisions that has to be made to evaluate those investments. Right? So we move on to the next topic. Before we move on to the next topic, any questions from anyone? Sure. We move on to the next topic. Yeah.
Yeah, you can proceed, sir.
Sure. On separate financial statements. Separate financial statements are prepared in accounting for investment in subsidiaries, JVs, associates. When the entity elects to prepare a separate financial statements, all the local law requires to prepare a separate financial statements. Like today, the company law prescribes that an entity should prepare a separate financial statements. Like there's a local law requirement or entity in itself elects. Of course, in India, while we talk about Ind AS, there is a requirement of company law which says you have to prepare a separate financial statements. In these separate financial statements, it's not a consolidated financial statement, it's a separate financial statements wherein the investment in subsidiaries, JV, associates, these are accounted for at cost or in accordance with Ind AS 109. And for same category of assets, for investments, for same accounting for each category of investment. For one category of investment, we have to follow the same policy of accounting for each category of investments. Of course, a parent need not present a consolidated financial statements. I'm not deliberating on this. We saw it earlier when what are the conditions based on which we need not present consolidated financial statements. entity that is exempt from consolidation or which is not applying the equity method may present separate financial statement as its only financial statements. For example, those venture capital funds which are exempt from consolidating, the investment entities which are exempt from consolidating, for them the separate financial statements as its only financial, they can prepare a separate financial statements and that will be its only financial statements. Where there is no financial say, for example, a company does not have subsidiaries, but there are associate joint venture to which equity method is applied. It is not a separate financial statements, right? A separate financial statements, all those investments in joint venture equity, everything is carried at cost. Everything is carried at cost. These are not financial statements where there is no subsidy, but still associate and joint ventures are accounted using equity method. These are not separate financial statement. Because in separate financial statements, equity method is not applied unless the law requires separate financial statements need not be appended to a consolidated financial statement. But of course, company law requirements in India is that we attach those separate financial statements as well along with the consolidated financial statements. Measurement is pretty simple, wherein we apply all accounting standards as usual, the Ind AS as usual, except that investment in subsidiaries and JVs and associates are accounted for at cost, not through equity method. At cost, it's been accounted, and dividend is accounted based on right to receive. Right to receive. Here there are in accounting standards. If you see, there are few in the Ind AS 27 has a reorganization of a parent company, wherein the shares of a parent company are issued to another company, and effectively that company becomes entity, a controlling entity of this. In such cases, how the measurement has to happen, how the separate financial statement needs to be prepared, there are enough guidance given in the standard. So disclosure requirements: disclose when they are prepared. When there is an exemption from consolidation. For example, we saw those investment entities or venture capital funds which are exempt from consolidation. Mention that it is a separate financial statement and the exemption has been used, and the name and the principal place of business of entity that presents the consolidated financial statements, and where we can get, and list of those significant investments, the name investees, the principal, and what is the share or what is the ownership interest in those entities, and the method used to account for those investments. If separate financial statements are prepared in addition to consolidated financial statements, fact that financial statements are separate, reason why separate financial statements are prepared if not required by law, this may not be the case in Ind AS, where the company law prescribes to have a separate financial statement as well. Of course, the disclosure on the significant investments and method used is the same as in the earlier case. There's a question from how to consolidate parent company GAAP is applicable and associate Ind AS is applicable. So I'm not understanding this case, say, because say for example, parent company GAAP is applicable, Ind AS is applicable because being a company parent to a company to which Ind AS is applicable, is it not that the parent itself should also comply with Ind AS? Will there be a case where the parent GAAP is applicable and so the idea is it has to be while if there's a different GAAP, a GAAP is used and Ind AS is used, there has to be the parent company while it reports whatever be the reporting regulations, the framework that the parent company is going to use, the subsidiary company has to be converted to that respective accounting framework. But I don't see a case where parent uses a GAAP and subsidiary uses an Ind AS. But assuming that such case is there, it has to convert it into the accounting framework that the parent is using and then done. For example, there are so many companies which use different accounting outside India as well, right? So the companies which use US GAAP, company which use other accounting frameworks as well. So those companies what they do is those have to be converted to the accounting framework of the parent and then applied. Do we have the option of using? Yes. In such cases, what happens is, so there are two questions here. Company was an associate last year until current year till June. Later it became subsidiary. In consolidation, how to disclose goodwill and minority interest. So what happens here, Mahesh? While the associate entry last year, until that time, you would have accounted for the investments using equity method. And at the point of time when you think the control, when you have the control over the entity, when you have control over the entity, you will start controlling those, consolidating those assets and liabilities into your balance sheet at the time that you think the company has acquired the control over the investee, and those financial statements will get consolidated. See what will happen for your share of accounting. Anyway, you would have accounted that equity based on the your share of net profit, your share of the net assets of this entity. So based on which the balance, say for example, you were 20-30% and you are accounting it based on the equity method. While you became acquire another 30 and you became 60, balance 40% will become a non-controlling interest, and you account for those non-controlling interest for the share of net assets that they have in the balance sheet, or they have in the balance sheet. So we'll move on, in interest of time, we'll move on to the disclosure of interest in other entities. So this is a disclosure standard, as we saw in that slide, wherein whether be it the subsidiary or JV or joint operation or associate, there are disclosures as per Ind AS 112 that needs to be given. So this applies to a subsidiary interest. The disclosure as per 112 is to be given to an interest that the company has in its subsidiary or joint arrangement or associate or unconsolidated structured entity. Of course, it does not apply to post-employment benefits or a joint arrangement where joint control does not exist, or there are those exempt cases where these are exempt. Other than those cases, the general subsidiary or a joint arrangement where there's an interest, all these cases, the disclosures as per Ind AS 112 needs to be provided. Of course, the idea behind having this standard is that there were various companies where the investors had interest, but not in terms of shareholding or not in terms of what are those rights and obligations that the investor has in those investees. So to bring about the transparency, that the standard came in, and it was adopted in India as well as Ind AS 112. Of course, the idea is to disclose the investments that we have and nature of risk associated with those investments, and what is the interest that the entity has in those investments. The idea is to have strike a balance between overburdening the financial statements with more details and not being able to give a proper picture of what is the real risk and what is the interest that the entity has. To have adequate information to be provided to the readers of the financial statements, rather than giving more of data wherein they lose sight of what is the risk which is there. Predominantly in case of subsidiaries, the disclosure is on the what is the composition of the group, what is the how much of the involvement of non-controlling interest that is there, what are the risks that are associated with these entities, and what are the unusual transactions, and what are the restrictions that the company has in terms of access to the assets, in terms of repatriation of the funds. All those disclosures needs to be provided. Unconsolidated structured entities. what is the nature, purpose, what is the investment that you have made, what is the income, the kind of income that the company is getting, and what is the carrying amount that is there for all these assets, the investment that has been made in consolidated structured entities, and what is the maximum exposure to loss that the entity has by investment in those entities. Joint arrangement associate, most probably this is also similar disclosures as that of subsidiaries. And what are the interests, what is the nature and the type of interest that the company has, what is the unrecognized share of losses that the company today holds in terms of the its share in the joint arrangements, what is the unrecognized share of losses, what is the significant restrictions on transferring funds does it have, what is the risk associated with that, what are those commitments and contingent liabilities which the company has incurred because of that interest or because of that investment in the joint arrangement. Of course, here, while we determine there are significant judgments and estimated to be made in terms of determining what are the risks that is associated, what are the risks that is associated with the investment that it has. The company has to disclose the judgments and estimates it has made in types of in determining what are those risks and what are those losses which the company expects, and what are the restrictions that is there in transferring funds. The disclosure with regard to those judgments and estimates needs to be made. So unconsolidated structured entities or investment entities that we saw in Ind AS 110, where the purpose is to have the incomes, the funds consolidated and investment and to be invested in different instruments. And in that case, what is the carrying amount of assets and liabilities, and what is the exposure to the loss comparison, what is the exposure to the loss, and what is the carrying value, and what is the non-contractual support that the entity has provided to the investment entities so as to benefit from its returns. So this Ind AS 112, sorry to rush you through this Ind AS 112. These are disclosure standards for those control subsidiary cases, control cases, or significant influence cases, joint ventures, associate. These are disclosure standards with regard to the investment profile. So there's an estimate that we need to give on maximum exposure to loss that is there in case it is. So the entity has to disclose the loss for its interest in their entity. Of course, we saw any information that we provide has to we have to strike a balance between the overburdening of financial statements with the information than giving them the information which is critical for them to take this decision and assess what is the risk that is associated with this investment. And thanks for listening out for 2 hours. I think I had to rush through for the last 10 minutes, but any further queries is there, you may contact me in this number, or my email ID is given below. You can write to this email ID. Please share your thoughts and you can stay in touch. Thanks everyone. Any queries is there? You can,
any questions from the delegates? You can take up 5-10 minutes, sir, so that we can conclude.
Yes.
Within 5-10 minutes.
Yes. Any questions is there? You can post in the chat. Thanks.
I hope members are very clear. Okay, sir, then we will conclude that it's my duty to propose vote of thanks. My sincere thanks to today's speaker, C.A. V. Ramanujan, sir, for his fabulous presentation on Ind AS 110, 111, and 112, and AS 28, 27. I would like to express my gratitude to all the esteemed delegates of the webinar for their presence and contribution to make this webinar a great success. With this, we'll conclude today's virtual webinar on Ind AS. Tomorrow again, we're going to join at 7:30 same. Thank you, one and all. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ramanujan, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Taking out your time in spite of your busy schedule.
No problem, sir. No problem.
Thank you very much for joining. On behalf of SIRC, my sincere thanks to you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.